Hey, what is going on, guys? XpertFusion here, and today we are doing one of the biggest videos I've ever decided to do on my channel, and this is ranking every single episode in The Walking Dead from worst to best. All 115 episodes, all the way from Season 1 to Season 8. We're going to be ranking them in my opinion order from 115 all the way to number 1. It's going to be a long video, so bear with me. I'm going to try to go through all of them as fast as possible. Some of them I might talk a little bit longer about because there might be more interesting things to talk about on specific episodes. Some things it might be really quick. All depends on how it is. If you want to scroll through it and just watch the top 10, by all means do that. If you want to watch the top 20, by all means do that. If you want to watch the whole thing, by all means do that. Do whatever you feel necessary, but we're going to go through every single episode and talk about why I placed it in that order specifically. This is my list, so they're my opinions. Let me know what yours are. I'm sure you don't want to tell me all 115 episodes ranked in the comments, so maybe just give me your top 10, maybe your top 5, top 20, and maybe your top 10 worst as well, whatever you want to do. And before I start, I also want to say I don't think any Walking Dead episode is bad. I think every episode is at least above like a 6 out of 10, so I think, you know, even though I'm putting a lot of episodes that may be considered pretty good by some people, pretty low, doesn't mean I hate the episode, doesn't mean I think it's a bad episode. It just means it's lower on my list compared to the amazing episodes that will show in like the top 50 of this list. So let's get into this. So coming in at the 115th spot on my list, what I believe is the worst episode in The Walking Dead history is Season 5, Episode 4, which is titled Slabtown. Slabtown is the Beth episode where we found out her in the hospital, and you guys probably know the episode. It wasn't very entertaining in my opinion. I felt like we didn't need a whole episode on that, very much so because she died 4 episodes later and the whole hospital storyline was just forgot about 4 episodes later, so it felt like a whole episode on it was kind of worthless. You know, people compare this to a more recent episode where it was a Tara only episode. People compare it to that, but the difference is the Tara only episode is coming in much more importance because Tara is still alive. She still brought more to the table. We have Oceanside was also more used as the seasons went on, but it wasn't just forgot about 4 episodes later. But the hospital and Beth, they were gone within 4 episodes, so it felt like this episode was worthless. That's why I believe it is one of the worst in the series. Actually, it is, in my opinion, the worst. I don't consider it a bad episode by any means, but it's just the worst out of all of them. Next up, we have Season 1, Episode 5, which was titled Wildfire. Wildfire, I felt like was a very, very uneventful episode. It was right before they went to the CDC. We saw Jim, you know, he's revealed to be bitten, and they had to leave him by the tree. And it wasn't a very eventful episode. It felt like it was a lot of just talking and not much development. Even with the talking, it didn't feel like there was much development. I just don't find myself going back and ever watching this episode because it wasn't eventful at all. It felt like it dragged on, so I just didn't enjoy this episode. And I don't find myself rewatching it like I do for basically every other, or at least the majority of episodes in The Walking Dead. So yeah, unfortunately I gotta put Wildfire pretty low. Next up, we have Season 1, Episode 4, which was titled Vatos. Came right before Wildfire, and it was eventful. It did have some interesting stuff happening, but I felt like it wasn't important to the story at all. It was just they came across this group that had some beef with them because, you know, Daryl shot the dude in the ass with an arrow. It was a kind of comical episode, and then they find out it's like a nursing home, and it's not really like scary people, and they just kind of talk, and they're like, all right, we're just going to go leave. It didn't feel like a Walking Dead episode, to be honest. I didn't enjoy this episode by any means. Honestly, you're going to find I didn't enjoy a lot of Season 1, except for the first like 2 or 3 episodes, but this episode just didn't hit for me. It's not an episode I go back and watch, just like Episode 5, and yeah. And next we got Season 2, Episode 5, which was titled Chubacabra. Chubacabra was an interesting episode because we saw Daryl kind of get some development for the first time in the whole series, really, because before he was just a crazy redneck. Now we learned more about him. He was on his own, and we learned, you know, how he likes to act. He's a lot more on the lone side of things, but he still has, you know, feelings about things. He even remembers his brother, who he didn't really get along with, as you could tell, but he still loves him, and we get to see that by remembering him when he was hurt and having the flashbacks. So that was interesting. But other than that, it wasn't very eventful. It really wasn't, just like a lot of other Season 2 episodes, at least in the beginning of Season 2. We had some scenes with Rick and Shane, which were interesting. They started rising tensions between them, rising tensions with the barn, because, you know, that was something that Glenn found at the end of the episode, and he was like, holy shit, there's walkers in the barn. That was pretty interesting. Still more looking for Sophia, though, and in my opinion, kind of got, you know, old after a while. And next up, we have an episode that came right before Chubacabra, which was Season 2, Episode 4, Cherokee Rose. Only really part I enjoyed about this episode was the Glenn and Maggie stuff. I love the Glenn and Maggie stuff. I thought that was really interesting and really entertaining to watch. And it, you know, started a relationship that really, really developed very well over the past, like, 5 seasons after this. Obviously, it ended pretty brutally, but we got some development with that. We had some funny scenes with them. It was just a funny episode. Just, you know, it wasn't really a serious or eventful episode. They spent way too much time on that well walker. I felt like that well walker was completely worthless. There was no importance to the well walker, but they spent a lot of time on that. Also, more looking for Sophia, stuff like that. So, like I said, you know, not very eventful. So this episode follows the trend of the last few. It is Season 1, Episode 3, which is Tell It to the Frogs. Kind of follows the trend where it doesn't feel very eventful. It feels kind of like it drags on, and it's not really that important to this overall story. But it is the earlier episodes, and they did develop the characters in a good way that I thought was necessary for the plot. We had some interesting stuff between the introduction of Daryl, and they were all like fighting over, you know, the fact that they left Merle in Atlanta and they have to go back now. I liked that. I liked Rick. The beginning of the episode was great when we saw Rick come back to Carl and Lori, and there's amazing music in the background. Everyone was crying. That was great. I love that part of the episode. But other than that, just like the other ones, not very eventful. Season 2, Episode 2, which was titled Bloodletting, I felt like was the first episode where we really saw the characters realize they're in the apocalypse. Like, yeah, we had some good episodes in Season 1, like Season 1, Episode 4, where it did have that intense scene with the walkers attacking the camp. That does feel like an apocalyptic type vibe, but at the same time, it just feels like any other tragedy. I felt like this episode really felt like the characters were like, holy shit, we are in a world that is probably never going to go back to how it used to be. They're literally in the worst case scenario. They just spent a whole bunch of days on the road, and now Carl gets shot. Okay, shot. And I love the parallels between him getting shot and Rick being shot, you know, back when he was a police officer. I love that. But other than that, the episode was pretty uneventful in terms of other characters and stuff like that. It was just kind of roaming around, looking for Sophia again. It wasn't that great eventful, but I did like the scenes with Carl, Rick, Lori, and Shane all at the house, like being sad over Carl getting shot because they have no idea what's going to happen. I thought that was really great. But other than that, like I said, not very eventful. Next up, we got Season 3, Episode 5, which was titled Say the Word. This was the episode after the great episode of Lori dying and T-Dog dying and the baby being born and all that type of stuff. And I love the interesting parts about this episode because there are some great parts about this episode, but other than that, it does feel uneventful. We did have Rick going insane. That was like the best part of the episode when he just grabs the axe. He's like, screw this shit, and he goes ham on those walkers inside the prison. I love that stuff. But then other than that, we had, you know, Maggie and Daryl out on the supply run, which wasn't very eventful. We had some of the Woodbury stuff, which wasn't very eventful. So it definitely felt like one of those episodes that you were just like, all right, not much happens. You know, I'm not going to rewatch this episode because there wasn't any like holy shit moments like I expect. But it was a character development episode, and we do need those. We need those. So I'm not complaining about the episode. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying compared to the other episodes, it's a lot lower on the list. Next, we got Season 4, Episode 6, which is titled Live Bait. Live Bait was a pretty... It was a boring episode. I'm just be honest here. The governor is a great character, and I loved him. But honestly, I didn't want to see the governor go into a state of being a good person, I guess, because he's a villain. I wanted him to be the worst possible person, so I didn't like how this episode kind of portrayed him as a good person. But obviously, all those feelings went away for Episode 7, but this is talking about Episode 6 specifically. And looking back on it after seeing Episode 7 and Episode 8, I actually enjoyed this episode more than I did at first. but it still is a pretty uneventful episode. It's just the governor walking around, being all sad, coming across these people, kind of getting, close with the little girl, and then, them learning that, yeah, people turn and this world is a shit storm. And it was okay. It was alright, but like I said, not anywhere near other episodes. Next we have Season 2, Episode 8, which is titled Nebraska. Nebraska did not have many interesting things happening in the first half of the episode, but once we get to that ending, that was pretty great. This is the first time we saw Rick kill other humans on the show. I don't know if it was his first people he's ever killed in his entire life. Maybe he's killed other people and, as being a cop. But this is when Rick Grimes turned into Savage Rick Grimes, and I loved it because he knew these motherfuckers were going to pull out their guns and try to kill him. He knew it, so he said screw it, and he pulled it out faster and shot the two of them. I loved that. But other than that, it was pretty uneventful. It was just Herschel mourning, other people mourning, and Lori going out on her own, being the Lori she is. So really wasn't that eventful, but that end scene was pretty dope. Next up, we have Season 3, Episode 3, which was titled Walk With Me. It was the introduction to Woodbury, necessary episode, but just wasn't very eventful. We only had, a few things going on. It was important to the story, but compared to other episodes, I gotta say, wasn't that great. Next, we have my least favorite Season 7 episode, which is Season 7, Episode 3, The Cell. The Cell felt insanely uneventful, but it was, important as developing the Sanctuary, but we didn't really get the deep, in-depth Sanctuary development until Episode 7, so this episode felt like it was introducing it, but it wasn't fully introducing it. It was just semi-introducing it, and it was just showing them torture towards Daryl, and some good development for Dwight that I definitely enjoyed, but it felt like it was just an episode developing those two characters, and that was it, and it didn't really do much else for the story, so unfortunately I gotta put it pretty low. Next we have Season 2, Episode 6, which is Secrets. Secrets was a funny and, fun kind of episode. It wasn't really that serious, but it was eventful. It definitely had a lot of things going on, a lot of development of characters, a lot of new secrets coming out, and I thought it was funny how Glenn had all these secrets of the barn, of Lori being pregnant, of all this type of stuff. I've heard of him sleeping with Maggie and all this stuff, and then, there were funny scenes with him and Dale. I enjoyed the episode overall, but as a Walking Dead episode, I don't know if it holds up anywhere close to a lot of the other episodes we've got in the series. Season 3, Episode 13. I remember how excited I was for this episode because we were finally seeing Rick and the governor together in the same room, and I was so hyped. And it ended up just being them talking over some plans, and that's really it. Nothing really changed in the overall deal. But looking back on the episode after, the past 8 seasons, I actually kind of enjoyed it more than I did at first. At first, I thought it was my least favorite episode in the entire series. But looking back on it, I feel like it was important, and I feel like it was necessary. But overall, just still does not compare to other Walking Dead episodes anywhere close. Next up, we have Season 4, Episode 7, Dead Weight, the other governor episode in Season 4, which I enjoyed a lot more than this Episode 6, and it showed the darker side of the governor. I loved that they did that. When he killed Martinez, I was like, damn, this is hype, and it just brought a ton of excitement and a ton of build-up and setup for the finale, which you'll see where that episode is. It's really high up there, so don't expect to see it anytime soon, but this episode just definitely brought to the dark side of the governor that I really wanted to see, and it brought into light some really interesting scenes later on in the next episode, so yeah. Next up, we have Season 2, Episode 11, Judge, Jury, Executioner. This is the one where Dale unfortunately died, and I gotta say, it didn't feel like that good of an episode. Some of the highlights of it was, of course, Dale's death. Not that it was a good thing to see him die, but it was good for the story. I felt like, even though it was forced, considering the actor wanted to leave, it wasn't like a story decision. It was literally the actor wanted to leave. I also liked the part when Rick was about to kill Randall, and then Carl comes in and says, "Do it," and that kind of makes Rick rethink, killing Randall. I like that. I like the Randall story arc. This is the part of season 2 that I actually kind of enjoyed, but this episode specifically is kind of further back. Next up, we have at number 99, season 7, episode 5, Go-Getters. Go-Getters was, I don't know, I like the hilltop and I like seeing the hilltop. I definitely think it's one of my favorite communities to watch. It's a very cool feeling community. It kind of feels like some old sort of, Oregon Trail type place. I don't know, it just feels like a good place, but this episode kind of just felt like it was dragging on for way too long. I loved Maggie in this episode. She had a lot of cool scenes. I loved how she was bringing on that leadership role, but other than that, it felt flat. A lot of the talk between Gregory and Simon was pretty interesting, but it went on for way too long. Some of the action scenes just didn't really need to be there, so overall, wasn't that great of an episode. Next up, we have season 4, episode 15, Us. This episode is actually not that bad, but unfortunately, I have to put it pretty damn low. But some of the most highlights of this episode was obviously the Maggie and Glenn reunion. That scene was incredible. We have a lot of great development of Tara. I actually thought Tara was going to die this episode. Good thing she didn't, because she ended up being one of my favorite characters as time went on. We also had the insane stuff with Daryl and the Claimers, which was a group I actually really enjoyed more than people ever talk about. But overall, just like I said, like most episodes, it wasn't that important in some ways, and it was definitely, we saw Rick for like 2 seconds in the episode. It was definitely, I was getting, what's the word? I was getting sick of not seeing Rick. You know what I mean? I wanted to see him, and we didn't see him for a while. But overall, okay episode, not great, not bad. So if you couldn't tell, we're getting past all the bad episodes, or what I consider to be the lesser episodes. Now we're getting into all like the okay episodes. Next we have the Suicide King, season 3, episode 9. The beginning of this episode was really freaking amazing. It was, Daryl and Merle fighting each other to the death like the governor wanted, but then Maggie, Rick, and the others come to the rescue, and that was a really intense sequence, probably one of the best openings of any Walking Dead episode. But then the rest of the episode felt slow and felt like it was dragging on. The end of it was pretty great, seeing Rick just go insane. Stuff with Tyrese and stuff like that wasn't that interesting, but overall, okay episode. Next, we got season 4, episode 12, Still, the episode that everybody hates, everybody always talks trash about, everyone always says it's terrible, the worst episode in The Walking Dead. Personally, I think it's probably one of the most underrated episodes. People hate on it, but honestly, the development that Daryl and Beth got towards the end of the episode was pretty fucking incredible. Before that, I agree, very slow episode, kind of like, what's the point? Why are we watching a whole episode about a girl getting alcohol? But the last like 10 to 15 minutes was very, very good, very great. Amazing writing and acting and dialogue and everything like that, but that's just the last 15 minutes. Before that, yeah, I'd consider it a pretty boring episode, but that's why it's, kind of in the okay position, because it's got some good parts, also it's got some bad parts. Next, we have season 4, episode 4, Indifference. Very, very interesting episode. It has a lot of awesome stuff with Carol and Rick and the back and forth between them, because it was just right after Rick found out that Carol killed Karen and David. This is a very interesting part of the season 4 beginning. It was the whole sickness story arc, but it was definitely like a standstill, I felt like, because we had 2 groups on the run. We didn't get to see anything in the prison except for the very beginning. But, besides the Rick and Carol stuff, I felt like the other stuff kind of was dragging on. It was the stuff with Daryl, Tyrese, Michonne, and Bob at the hospital place trying to get all the medicine for the sick people. And it wasn't terrible, but it just wasn't that amazing to watch. The amazing parts were Rick and Carol and the dialogue between them. That was the great stuff. But even then, it still felt a little slow and wasn't the most entertaining episode in the world. Next, we have season 4, episode 1, the premiere, 30 Days Without an Accident. This episode was a really good way to bring us back into The Walking Dead. It felt like that was really, really clear. Had a lot of introduction of new characters, a lot of introduction of new storylines, and that was great. But sometimes setup can be a little bit obviously it's not going to be as good as the payoff. The payoff comes in the later episodes, and you'll see those later episodes obviously later on in the list. But this episode was more of a setup, and that's why it felt more flat than other episodes. But in terms of the development and the setup and what it was used for, it did its job. So it's definitely a positive. Season 5, Episode 9, What Happened and What's Going On. This is the one when Tyrese died. Very, very artistic, sort of well-directed and edited episode. I loved how it was, had all this, flashbacks, had all those symbolic things on the screen. I liked that. But as an overall episode, it felt weird having Tyrese die an episode after Beth died in, the first episode back. It just felt like a weird placement. I felt like this episode would have been a lot better if it was later on in the season, maybe, episode 10 or 11. But just having it straight after losing Beth, felt like we were already drained out of all our emotions after losing Beth. And now we get Tyrese die. It's holy shit. But, I don't know. I felt like it wasn't the greatest way to give Tyrese his death, even though it was a very well done episode in terms of the editing and the directing and all that other stuff. But in terms of the death, it kind of made the episode not as impactful as other episodes. And it felt like we didn't really need it other than killing off Tyrese, I don't know. That's just me. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 2, The Well. The Well was the introduction of the beautiful kingdom. We had Ezekiel, Shiva, all these new characters being introduced. That's great. I love all that stuff. I love introduction episodes for any groups, but that doesn't mean it didn't feel a little slow and kind of boring, honestly. I wasn't that entertained. That episode, it's not an episode I can rewatch. Introduction episodes are not episodes you can really rewatch over and over again, because you get the introduction, you get to see these new characters, and it's all right, now we know these new characters, and seeing it again, it was really no action. There really was no amazing character development, dialogue type scenes. It was more of just showing us who these new people are and how they're going to be important to the story in the future, which is good. Next up, we have Season 6, Episode 15, East. This episode was pretty awesome. It had a lot of Morgan and Rick stuff. I love the Morgan and Rick stuff in this episode. But other than that, the episode did feel slow compared to the rest of Season 6, because Season 6 was just an insane, fast-paced masterpiece. It's the only episode where it was alright, it's kind of just, you could tell it's not really going that, far. But we did have some pretty awesome stuff, especially the ending. Maggie having the stomach issues, and that was really shocking for us. We didn't know if she was, they had miscarriage or something like that. We had no idea. We had Glenn and Michonne getting captured. We had Daryl getting shot, and that freaked us all out. So definitely some cool stuff here and there. I'd say the Rick and Morgan stuff is the best, especially after seeing later on episodes in season 8. Definitely is a cool, sort of reflection against how they are in season 8 versus how they are in this season. So it was cool, but not the best. Next up at number 90, we have When the Dead Come Knocking In, Season 3, Episode 7. This is an episode that kind of amped you up for the mid-season finale. They had a lot of Glenn torture scenes, which were actually entertaining to watch. I loved seeing Glenn take out that walker after being, tied up, completely vulnerable, and that was one of the most badass Glenn scenes. I think this is the episode where Glenn finally became, a badass character, because previously he was just a pizza boy, no one really thought of him as a badass. This episode proved people wrong, so definitely a good part about it. It was also really intense towards the end. They were going to attack Woodbury. I loved all that. Loved all the stuff with Michonne, being introduced to the group. It was a good episode, but it just is nowhere near compared to the higher up episodes on this list in terms of, it was a little slow towards the middle part of it, which is probably the biggest problem I have with this episode. Next, we have Season 4, Episode 9, After. This is the episode after the whole Too Far Gone governor attack of the prison. It was a very good return to the show, after a long mid-season break. And I loved how they kind of split up this half season between different characters. People didn't like that, but I personally liked it. It gave, episodes that felt more organized. They felt more, you knew what character was getting development that episode. And this was a great Carl episode. If you love Carl, you're going to love this episode. Carl's, I think, a great character, and I enjoyed him a lot during these seasons, so he was definitely interesting to watch. He was a little brat, but that made him interesting. Next up, we have Season 2, Episode 1, What Lies Ahead. A lot of people, I think this is a pretty overrated episode. I've seen a lot of people say it's a great episode. This is an A1 episode. I don't see it. I mean, I do see a few parts. The whole on the highway with the walkers passing by them was really intense, and then Sophia getting lost. All that was great, but a lot of the other parts, it was a really long episode, and it felt like the majority of it was just them talking about what they're going to do next, them talking about, the world sucks now. Where's Sophia? It started the episodes of the boring parts of season 2, which is like the beginning era. So I don't know. It wasn't my favorite, but it wasn't terrible. Definitely wasn't terrible. Next up, we have season 7, episode 11, Hostiles and Calamities. This episode felt like it was unnecessary to have it just be Eugene and Negan and Dwight development, but it wasn't at the time. I was really just like, I just don't care. Watching it again, though, I actually enjoyed it more than I did the first time, just because, we just got through this depressing part of season 7. It was really, sad, all people dying left and right. And then they bring us into them rising up. They wanted to come back and fight, and we had episode 9 and 10, which were solid episodes. And then we get this one, and it just wasn't the same as the other ones. I don't know, maybe it was just because I didn't really care too much about Eugene. Maybe we got more Negan in the episode. We didn't have much Negan. There was like maybe a scene or two of Negan. It was mainly Dwight and Eugene. It wasn't a bad episode. I'm not saying it was a bad episode, but it was okay. It broke a trend for The Walking Dead too, because every episode of The Walking Dead has had at least one walker kill. At least one walker has died in an episode of The Walking Dead. But this was the first episode in the history of Walking Dead that decided to not have a walker kill in the episode, which I thought was interesting. It's not a big deal, but I don't know. I felt like that was like a thing about The Walking Dead. They always made sure there was at least one walker kill in the episodes. This episode broke the trend, but whatever. It wasn't that big of a deal to me. Next up, we have season 4, episode 10, which is titled Inmates. This episode was interesting because it was after the Too Far Gone, the big episode with Herschel dying and all that, and we got to see kind of the episode split up into 4 parts, where we had obviously Beth and Daryl in the beginning, which was kind of I didn't really care too much about that. Then we had Tyrese and the little girls, and that was interesting because we saw Carol come back. That was great. Then we saw Maggie just crying for about 10 minutes, which was the most interesting thing in the world. But then the ending, which was Glenn escaping the prison and then finding Tara, and then we meet Abraham, Eugene, and Rosie at the very end. That was the best part of the episode. I would say the last 10 minutes with Glenn and Tara, I enjoyed that the most. But overall, still a pretty, meh episode. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 5, Self-Help. This is the bottle episode, I guess you can call it, where Glenn, Abraham, Tara, that whole group went out to go to where Eugene was saying there was going to be a cure, and then we obviously found out at the end that there's no cure. I enjoyed this episode, actually. I did. It was entertaining, but it did feel a little like, slow at times. But it was a necessary episode. It was very, very necessary for the development of Abraham, Eugene, and Rosita. And actually, really not really Rosita. They didn't really develop Rosita in Season 5, honestly. We didn't get Rosita's development until like later in Season 7, to be completely honest. I thought before that Rosita was always just kind of a stale character, but it was still development that was much needed for the story. Therefore, still necessary episode, just not the greatest. Next, we have Season 3, Episode 11, which is I Ain't a Judas. This episode was interesting because we get to see Andrea come back to the group, and she kind of is, reacting to all these crazy things going on. She finds out Lori's dead, she finds out T-Dog's dead, she finds out Shane died, and all this crazy stuff. I like this episode from an entertaining standpoint, but obviously, in terms of story, it did feel a lot slower than what I, would want in an episode. But it definitely came after a really intense end to episode 10, and we obviously got a very good episode right after this. So it was a necessary episode, yeah, but wasn't anything too special. Next up, we have the Season 1 finale, TS19. This was episode 6 of Season 1. And I would have to say this episode was pretty interesting at the time because we didn't really know much about the apocalypse, so we got to see, what was going on, and I think that was a good thing. I'm pretty sure Robert Kirkman says he wishes he never did this episode because he doesn't want, the cure to be explained, kind of like it's not really explained in the comics, but not the cure, the disease, the outbreak. They don't want to explain it, but they did do this episode in the series to explain it because they thought it would make it more clear to the viewers as to what exactly this whole apocalypse, what the walkers are like, what they act like, why they act that way, stuff like that. And it didn't give us that many answers, so I don't see why he didn't like it that much, because it only, clarified certain things about the virus and made things more clear, and that's something I enjoyed about the episode. And I thought it was good. It just wasn't a great finale by any means necessary, I guess you could say. Next up, we have Season 7, Episode 14, The Other Side. This episode had a really good opening sequence. It had a really good soundtrack in the sequence, and it had a really just awesome opening. I loved it. There was like no words. It was just pure 4 minutes of an amazing soundtrack and amazing directing. That I loved. But then the rest of the episode kind of fell flat for me personally. It was a lot of just Rosita and Sasha talking on their own, and then a little bit of the Hilltop stuff. But, you know, the Hilltop episodes, like the Hilltop Bottle episodes in Season 7, some of them just weren't very good, and it was nothing to do with the Hilltop. I enjoy the Hilltop as a location. I love seeing it, but I felt like their Hilltop Bottle episodes in this season, or just they just never were really that interesting. I don't know. It did have a very awesome... I like the back and forth between Gregory and Simon in this episode. It was definitely a lot better than the back and forth between Gregory and Simon back in Episode 5. So that was good, but other than that, really wasn't much else to say about this episode, to be completely honest. So it was a good, not great episode. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 6, Consumed. I thought this episode was okay episode. This is one where it was kind of a bottle episode with Carol and Daryl. It was a lot of good Carol and Daryl development overall. And I loved the fact that we saw Atlanta again. We saw the city. I love that because I like city locations in The Walking Dead. We don't get to see them that often. When we do, they're pretty awesome. And this episode was a perfect example. But that doesn't mean it didn't feel like it was kind of dragging on for too long. And it felt like we didn't need all of it. But we did need a lot of it. It was definitely a lot of it. Was definitely necessary for sure. Some of the scenes didn't make sense, like the one car falling, the truck or the van falling off the bridge. That scene made no sense, but it didn't really matter that much. It was still a well-developed episode for the characters and kind of introduced, you know, Noah to the group and stuff like that. Interesting, not great. Next up, we have Season 5, Episode 2, Strangers. This episode was interesting. It had the introduction of Father Gabriel, who ends up actually being a pretty prominent character in later seasons, for sure. Definitely Season 7 and 8. He was very prominent. And I love the ending of this episode. You know, the beginning was okay. You know, it was just introducing Father Gabriel in the church and all that. Had some really interesting scenes. This is like the first 5 episodes of Season 5 I really enjoyed. Or the first 3 episodes I meant. Really enjoyed. I love the ending. The ending was so dark and just, man, that was an amazing ending. That's the best part of the episode for sure. The rest of it, you know, was okay, I would say. Nothing overly exciting. But I would say the whole Bob getting his leg eaten at the end was the pinnacle point of the episode. Next, we have Season 8, Episode 6, The King, the Widow, and Rick. What I would say is my least favorite episode of Season 8. Which is pretty crazy. That just says a lot about Season 8 because my least favorite episode of the season is still higher than the worst 30 episodes, which is still pretty damn good. The King, the Widow, and Rick was a slow, really slow burn of an episode because we went through 5 action-packed, intense episodes, and then we get this. So that's kind of what made it fell off. It was like, you know, going really fast-paced season, and then it's like, oh, this episode came. Some of the scenes, some of the action fell off. There was a little bit of action, I did like Rosita blowing up that dude with RPG. That was awesome, but other than that, some of the scenes just weren't. They felt choppy, and they didn't feel great. Nothing too special. I love the opening though. The opening had a really good soundtrack as well as just a really deep, in-depth type of storytelling. Wise, it was going through the different, Carol reading the letter from Rick, and Rick reading the letter from Maggie, and them just sharing letters with each other to tell them what's going on in the war. It felt really warlike, and that was great. Next, we have Season 3, Episode 6, Hounded. I enjoyed this episode very much at the time because it was a big twist when we saw Merle come and approach Glenn and them, and then he starts shooting at them. That was the pinnacle of the episode, but everything else before that, I'm not gonna lie, kind of meh. I mean, I enjoyed the beginning. Everything with Michonne versus Merle in this episode was great. Seeing them fight each other in the woods and stuff like that, and got Julio and telling him to look at the birds, and then he shot him in the head. That was funny. I like those scenes. Really, anything with Merle in this episode was great. But other than that, there was some prison scenes and there was some Woodbury scenes that just weren't that interesting at the time. even though it might have been pretty important to the story, because it kind of was. So next we have Season 6, Episode 6, Always Accountable. This was the introduction of the Saviors, which I thought was a really good introduction of Dwight, Sherry, and Dwight and Sherry as well, which was awesome. Everything with Daryl, Dwight, and Sherry I enjoyed in this episode. I thought they had a really good, interesting story going on. You know, the introduction of the Saviors was great, but everything with Sasha and Abraham just made me want to just die. Honestly, I really had no interest in the relationship. I don't know why. I didn't, and I think this episode was kind of the start of it, and I just had no interest in it. Other than that one scene with Abraham getting the RPG, the rest of it, when they were talking in the room, it went on for way too long. But other than that, Daryl stuff with Dwight and the Saviors, that was great. So definitely enjoyed the episode for those portions. Next, we have Season 2, Episode 3, Save the Last One. This episode was one of the best episodes in Season 2. Definitely one of the best in like the first half of Season 2. Because like I said, the first half of Season 2 was pretty slow and was probably one of the worst portions of The Walking Dead history. But it did not take away from the fact that this episode was intense. It had some really intense sequences with Shane. And I mean, it was the start of the Shane becoming a villain. It really was. I mean, honestly, I would say maybe Season 1, Episode 6 was, sort of. Especially when he was trying to grab, you know, Lori and stuff like that, and he ended up getting his face ripped or scratched by Lori. But this episode, I said, was the start of him becoming an actual villain after killing Otis. Amazing. I love this episode's way of storytelling. I love this episode's way of directing. I loved a lot about this episode, but everything in between was meh, you know. But the stuff with Shane and Otis was the greatest.